This is when the brass comes in. And maybe since we're already here, I'm just going to pull up the brass and we can listen to it by itself. So this is a mixture of Berlin brass and Spitfire brass. The reason it's a mixture is I have yet to find a brass library that has the kind of... Okay, it's like, you know, it's like it'll fade in like this, or it'll fade in like this, and I just want it to fade in like this. I want the dynamics of the brass, because it's such a obvious sort of sound when they start getting louder. I want the dynamics to be like this. I mean, maybe a little bit that way or that way, but a lot of stuff is either like this or like this, and it gets really annoying when some of the same instruments are like slightly different curves. So you do a CC fade in, trying to make it sound like the whole brass section is fading in, getting louder, you know, pushing into a swell, and different instruments start poking out, and not in a cool, like, oh, it sounds like live orchestra way, in a, it sounds like MIDI and things aren't programmed the best way they could be sort of way. So when I did Forzo with Heaviosity and we worked on that together, one of the biggest things we wanted to make sure we got was super consistent dynamics on the swells. When you move your mod wheel or whatever controller you have to increase and decrease dynamics, it's buttery smooth and consistent across all the sections. That's honestly the first brass library that I've heard that does that. So I'll give you an example. You can hear that one pitch sticking out, right? It's fine, but I prefer definitely smoother, but I can kind of hear the inner workings, clockwork going on behind the scenes, where I love the smoothness of Berlin, but it's just not all together. So I found that both of them together, which is why I like combining string libraries, you sort of get the best of both worlds. It still sounds very MIDI, but in the mix, it's going to sound a lot better with them combined. And then I also had adventure horns. Now you may have noticed there's a pause at the end of each phrase. Every 2 bars, look at that. I've given the brass players a chance to breathe. And honestly, I just do that out of habit now, because it just makes it sound more live to me. But Aaron's Adventure Brass is very, very smooth. I really liked his envelopes and everything. And it's a closer miking, and it's in a smaller room. So a lot of times I'll use that to sort of blend everything together. And then you've got a really nice smooth. Now I'm pretty sure that I have the same CC data, this same CC data on everybody. It's just a curve that I copied and pasted because it's a very predictable sort of every 2 measures I want everybody to swell. And I did the same thing for the strings. It's just they're slightly less dynamic, because that's sort of the way they play naturally. And I wouldn't indicate as much of an extreme swell for strings in this sort of thing. I'd want them to be playing more of a kind of bread and butter padding. overall, it sounds like they're sustaining the chord. And it's just that little bit at the beginning and the end is how they would naturally, like if it was just written forte, the string section naturally starts their bow slower and kind of speeds up into the note, and then at the end of the note or at the end of the phrase, they slow their bow down again. So it's not like I'm going for extreme dynamic contour in the strings the way I was the brass. With breath and brass, it's even more dynamic. But I wanted to sort of just mimic the way the strings would be playing if it was just kind of goose eggs tied together. You know, long sustained notes. The overall sound is a homogeneous sustain, but you just sort of feel it ebb and flow really naturally with the phrasing. And then the brass is what's really giving it the push. And it's also the first time they come in and we go back to the major chord. So it's sort of a dramatic kind of re-entry. Now, as far as strings go, I've got 3 sets. So first, probably my favorite, if I had to pick one library, it would be Cinematic Studio Strings. But I also really love the chamber strings. You can hear the vibrato in there, right? And obviously a much brighter sound. But together they really sound great. There, I was letting you hear that reverb. It's like an extreme reverb, but it's also very quiet, which is another nice thing about having 3 reverbs, which, again, I'm not going to pull up and go into specifically, but it was a short, medium, and long. And the long was, I think, 12 seconds long, but it was also turned down. And when you looked at the faders, it kind of went short, medium, long. So the longer the reverb, the more low it was, or the lower it was in the mix. But when you hear that at the end, where I just paused, it's such a smooth kind of decay that it just works really well to kind of give a balance to everything. Here's the Consordino chamber strings. So if we throw them all in the mix together, and if we add the brass, oh, I didn't even play the low brass here, which is quite nice. Berlin brass only. Basically either octaves or fifths, very, very simple. And I think the low woodwinds that are also Berlin are essentially just doubling exactly what the brass is doing. So if we listen to those together, it's a nice homogenized sound. And then all of the strings, brass, and woodwinds. This is everybody stacked together. before, the horns were sort of going up in pitch. That's something that, I don't know if I saw that somewhere or that's just how I'm naturally inclined to do things. I just like, as a phrase builds and builds and builds, I like kind of inverting the chords and getting the horn. This is really, that's really high for the horns. I don't think I would write that in this passage for a live band, but it totally works with MIDI. They can pull it off. So they kind of go from this inversion of the chord this is the repeat, and instead of here, they jump up. And they really poke out. You could hear it in the mix. So everybody together. Is there anything else we're forgetting? Oh, yeah. Soaring strings. Another huge prop to Aaron. So right now they're just doubling the first and second violins. Yeah, right there, they start to poke out a little bit. And especially right here, they go to unison. So with this particular patch, I have them going out of a completely separate stem called melody. And most of the time, I think this is the only, there's another spot right here during the break when the strings are taking over the melody. I only use them for melodies in this particular instance. So if I do the strings, let's start here, you'll be able to hear when soaring strings really start to pop up and stick out. And it doesn't sound like it did just now, where it's very bare and like lots and lots of vibrato, which is an amazing sounding patch, but it blends so well with the rest of the band. And that vibrato really allows the melody to sort of sing and soar over everything else. And it might sound like maybe it's a little bit loud, but once I turn everything else on, sounds like a super amazing string section to me, especially the violins. And I'm only using the first and second violins to play the melody. If I wanted more power, I could throw the violas in there an octave lower, which I do very, very often, just not necessarily in this instance.